All right, everybody. So today we are looking at terms and definitions. And I've got myself here in the corner just for the beginning, but I have a lot of graphics in these slides, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off, and we can go ahead and get started. And I've got my eyes on the chat, so feel free to comment along and tell me if you need a more thorough definition of anything or if I've missed any terms that you're interested in. So the basics of origami tessellations start with the grid. And I define a grid as a pattern of evenly spaced folds that are used to locate other folds in a tessellation. And these folds are made to prepare the paper to fold the tessellation, and we'll get into the math of what a tessellation is. Technically speaking, just a grid on a paper would be a tessellation, but when we talk about folding origami tessellations, we're talking about doing more things to the grid so that the folds that are actually folded, not just creased, are the pattern that is the tessellation. So the two standard grids I have here on the screen, the square grid on a square sheet of paper, triangle grid on a hexagon, and the number of grid divisions for both of these is the number of spaces from one side to the opposite side. So from one side to the opposite side, which in these cases is the same as the number of divisions, these separate segments, along a line through the center. And we'll see in a moment, I tend to prefer the definition of number of divisions on the line through the center because that's more general. And then there's 45-degree grids. I define 45-degree grids as the number of divisions in the square grid, and then it's either a single diagonal per grid square or double diagonal per grid square. And you can also fold just a purely diagonal grid with just the diagonal lines without the underlying square lines. And by the way, pro tip, I would recommend folding all directions of grid lines as you work through, okay, halves, quarters, eighths, whatever. Make sure to be folding those diagonals as you're folding the background square grid, unless, of course, you're folding a diagonal grid that is offset from the center where the diagonals don't go through the center. That is the only situation where I'd recommend waiting to fold all the diagonals at the end. And then there's some other triangle grids. You can fold triangle grids on squares or rectangles, in which case there will be one pair of edges that is parallel to the grid lines and one pair that is perpendicular. The number of divisions on this grid is the number of full spaces from one parallel side to the other parallel side. Any other way you count, you get different numbers different times. And then there's diagonal grids on hexagons where the line through the center hits the center of the edge instead of the corner. And those are counted by, again, we want a whole number. If we count from the corner, we don't get a whole number. That's part of a division, but a whole number would be along this line through the center to get our number of grid divisions. And one little math secret hiding in the background here is that these ways of counting allow you to say, hey, I want 32 grid divisions. That's going to be divisions of 2 the whole time. I want 24 grid divisions. That's going to be a division of 3 and 3 divisions of 2. So the moves that you do to get the grid are the factors of the total number of divisions. And then moving on to folds that stay in the final pattern, a pleat. A pleat is a pair of mountain and valley folds, typically on parallel grid lines. There's all kinds of exceptions to this in other people's folding, but not in mine. The pleat depth is the distance in grid spacings between these mountain and valley folds. And yeah, Sarah in the chat, this is going to be recorded, and so you will be able to come back to it later, and I'm going to link the slides in the video description when I'm done. And then a set of parallel pleats is a group of multiple pleats, all, and when I say in the same orientation, I mean that the line that the fold is on is parallel for all of these different pleats. Not necessarily that they're folding over in the same direction, so it could be mountain then valley as you read from left to right, or it could be valley then mountain. Doesn't matter as long as those are in the same orientation. That is part of a set of parallel pleats. Now there's a particular kind of set of parallel pleats, which is a stair of pleats, where you always have the mountain then the valley, mountain then the valley, as you go from one side to the other, or vice versa if you flip the paper over. And we often see this in the equilateral triangles tiling. If you've done one of my Advent of Tessellation series, the first couple days are always just triangle twists, and so you'll often see this, and I'll talk about, okay, we're going to start at the top of the stairs because that's going to give us better pleat overlaps. And another thing that I commonly talk about with pleats is a tube pleat, and you can kind of sort of see at the bottom of this drawing that those valley folds end up meeting at the back. You can look at a tube pleat from either side of the paper and it's still a tube pleat. Basically, the definition for a tube pleat is that the distance between these inner folds of the two pleats is the same as the sum of the distances between the mountain and valley of the two separate pleats. Basically, the sum of the pleat depths of the two pleats is equal to the distance between the pleats. And so when they're folded, these outer folds meet in the folded form. And in almost all situations that I've taught, this number of spaces is 2, because we typically see 1 grid spacing between the mountain and valley of a pleat. And continuing onwards, pleat intersections. Pleat intersections are anything that happens where pleats meet. I typically reserve this term, pleat intersection, for something that's not more specific, like a pleat overlap, where one pleat has been folded first and the other pleat is folded second. So pleat overlap. And these are the crease patterns for pleat overlaps in the square and triangle grids. You'll notice that in one direction, the folds are uninterrupted, and in the other direction, they switch mountain valley assignment, and in the case of the triangle grid, they reflect over these unbroken lines, which actually puts the mountain fold coming out the far side on a different grid line than the mountain fold coming in. So that's an important thing to know about the triangle grid, that when you have a pleat overlap, only the pleat that went through first has its folds on the same grid lines. And And that's definitely important for setting up the next twists. So that's one form of more specific things that happen at the intersections. I also, like if it's a twist, I'll just call it a twist instead of a pleat intersection. So mostly I say pleat intersection for everything that's not an overlap or a twist. And then reordering a pleat overlap is changing which pleat was folded first. So in this square grid case, the vertical pleat was folded first. If we want to reorder that, we would make the horizontal pleat fold first and then the vertical. And then more about pleat intersections. A three-way intersection is a way to lay two pleats meeting at 120 degrees down flat without adding new folds. And a triangle wrap is the exact same move seen from the opposite side of the paper. So I'll often say, okay, we've got that triangle wrap, and now we're going to flip over and turn that into a triangle twist. This is basically the crease pattern of what I'm talking about. Then there's a compound wrap, and the compound wrap is functionally two triangle wraps mushed together. And you can kind of see that because in the triangle wrap, there's one three-way intersection of mountains, one three-way intersection of valleys. In the compound wrap, there's two of each. And we don't have that funny little leg joining because that ends up having more folds that accommodate the extra shrinkage in the paper. And yeah, basically the compound wrap has two pleats coming together at 60 degrees. It's hard to see just from the crease pattern, like which pleats, quote unquote, are coming together. But on the paper, when you're folding it, it's the two pleats that are coming directly from twists. And I'll mention that the compound wrap is basically lifted directly from the herringbone corrugation, also called the Mura Ori, which I do have a tutorial of on my YouTube channel, which you're already on if you're watching this video. And then there's a couple more pleat intersections. These can, but don't have to, use only existing grid lines. And these are some of the more common intersections that you'll come across. With the squares, you'll often see instructions to pre-crease everything. Likewise with these rabbit ear triangles. But I often find that that's not necessary. You can stand up the pleats and make functionally this part of it is a square base, like a traditional base, and then kind of go from there, adding in the crease through here, and it really does all even out and folds pretty precisely in the end. Likewise, this one down below, all of these square intersections where the mountains are all coming to a single point, I would just go ahead and fold directly from the grid. And we'll get into what pre-creasing is a little bit later, but suffice to say, it's folding all of the off-grid lines that you'll need for a particular pattern. And then twists, everyone's favorite topic. A twist is an interaction of pleats where the central shape rotates as it is folded. And so there's varying sizes. Like this particular one I happen to know that makes a closed triangle twist because all of these mountain folds are coming together to a single point. And you'll see that same single point on the back. So a closed twist has pleats surrounding a single point on the back, while an open twist has pleats surrounding a larger area. This is a good description of equilateral triangle, right triangle, square, and hexagon twists. The description doesn't extend as well to rhombus or trapezoid twists, or mixed depth, hexagon, rhombus, various other twists, mixed up squares as well. But these are kind of the terms in the origami community for describing the different sizes of these twists. So it goes closed, open, double open, triple open, however many open. And a right-handed twist, spinning around like this, is in a counterclockwise direction. And when I say it's spinning in this direction, that is literally how the center spins. We established that the center of a twist rotates when it's folded. But also what I'm looking for is if I'm going along a mountain fold from the center, like let's say I'm taking this one up to the top, is my parallel valley to the left or to the right? For a right-handed twist, that valley is to the left, which corresponds to sticking your thumb up in the center of the twist, your right hand, your fingers up along that mountain fold, and you curl your fingers, you hit the valley. If you use your left hand, you curl your fingers, and they're going around clockwise for the left-handed twist. And then the number line of twists. This is a discovery that I made. I organize it this way because there is a specific shift in the pleats between consecutive sizes. And this is the connection between, say, the closed square twist on the front and the closed square twist on the back. When I'm publishing in mathematical conferences and such, I'll say the twists in between the closed sizes on the front and the back are intermediating. When I'm talking to origami people, I call them cursed twists because you actually do have to pre-crease all of these off-grid lines, which are more than the usual off-grid lines, in order to get that folded. And by the way, for the vast majority of twists, with the exception of cursed twists, excuse me, you don't need to pre-crease the off-grid lines. You set up the pleats, and then you squash to make the new folds appear. So that's a very easy process, as opposed to, oh, I need to fold all 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 of these line segments in advance and then get them to all coordinate at once. I do not like that pre-creasing process. And then there's some special kinds of twists. A general twist is an arbitrarily open twist. Like if you can fold a hexagon twist, you usually start with a closed hexagon or an open hexagon. A general twist would be saying, okay, here's the principles of hexagon twists, and I expect you can fold any size of hexagon twist. That would be a general hexagon twist. And then an isoarea twist, like this one on the top, has the same crease pattern as a closed hexagon, but 3 of those pleats are acting right-handed and 3 of them are acting left-handed. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. 3 of them are in the original folding orientation, so with the line to the center as a mountain and the line to the side of the hexagon as a valley, but every other one is flipped so that the line to the center is a valley and the parallel fold is a mountain. So that actually gets the same setup on both sides of the paper. And isoarea, what it means is same on both sides. So that can be applied to a twist, it can be applied to a whole pattern. And that's more of a math term. And then a hybrid twist. This is one of my own terms. It mixes sizes of twists on a pleat by pleat basis. So this twofold rectangle hybrid hexagon twist, and we'll get into what I mean by twofold later on. It has these two pleats on opposite sides where the mountain's going straight into the center, and then the remaining four pleats have the mountain going around the center, one grid spacing away. So when you have a hybrid twist, you have some pleats approaching the center in one way and some approaching the center in another. And then there's mixed depth twists. Need a little water break there. And the mixed depth twists use multiple pleat depths in the same twist. So in this example, we've got skinnier pleats corresponding to shorter sides and thicker pleats corresponding to longer sides. You'll always see that correspondence. So if you see a shape that has multiple different side lengths, like a trapezoid, this stretched out hexagon, a parallelogram, which I usually call a mixed depth rhombus, or a rectangle, assuming it's not a hybrid hexagon twist rectangle. But if you see a rectangle in a square grid, then it'll be one of these mixed depth twists. And then a stacked twist has two twists that are folded in the same location, usually sequentially. So you'll fold one and then either fold another around it or fold one and fold another one on top of it. And I have and you'll see a lot of stacked twists in Miguel Gagnon's work. I have another definition that's a little bit narrower, which is a compound twist, which is a twist and then you fold another twist around it on the opposite side in the opposite rotational sense, so that you get tube pleats coming out of the twist. So that is a more limited definition than the general idea of stacking twists on top of each other. Then there's a bunch of terms that I borrow from math, and tessellation is one of them. It's a pattern that repeats exactly and fills a flat surface. Technically, this definition of repeats exactly is more specifically a periodic tessellation. And this general definition, the mathematical definition, includes any space-filling arrangement of shapes. It includes crease patterns. It includes folded origami tessellations. So when I'm talking about tessellation, I'm talking more about the properties of repetition, that the pattern repeats, instead of a particular thing, because a tiling is a tessellation. Mathematically, a crease pattern is a tessellation. Mathematically, a folded piece of paper in a repeating pattern is a tessellation mathematically. So this is a mathematical property of repetition. And then one of the things that I'll often see in short video comments is, oh, is this a fractal? And these are not fractals, because fractals specifically repeat on different size scales. So, or at different sizes. So if you're seeing repeats and they're exactly the same size, it's a tessellation. If you need to zoom in to see the repeats, it's a fractal. And there are origami fractals. I'll put a caveat here that in origami, we are representing a subset of the idea of a fractal or the idea of a tessellation. We cannot literally have infinitely many repeats. We cannot literally have repeats at infinitely small scale. So whenever we see origami tessellation or origami fractal, it's kind of a subset of a tessellation, a pseudo-fractal. So there's a little bit of translation that we usually leave out when we're talking about these mathematical constructs. And then there's rotational symmetry points. So there's a position of twofold rotational symmetry in the center of a parallelogram, because if you rotate this 180 degrees and you put them side by side, I can't tell them apart. Likewise, if you have a triangle, you rotate it 120 degrees, or you rotate it 240 degrees, I cannot tell those orientations apart from the original. And so there is a position of threefold rotational symmetry in the center of the triangle. These blue lines represent mirror symmetry lines, and we'll get to those in the next slide. So when I talk about rotational symmetry, the terminology that comes from mathematics is twofold or sixfold symmetry point. The fold there has nothing to do with actual folding. It's the number of orientations of the thing that are indistinguishable. And so that's 3 different uses of the word fold, because often with the number of grid divisions, I'll say, oh, it's a 32-fold grid. And then we've got the 6-fold rotational symmetry. And then we are literally creating folds on the paper. These are all distinct things. And one of the ways to tell them apart is that when I'm talking about symmetry points, I will only ever be talking about 2, 3, 4, or 6. And usually for the number of divisions, I'm talking about at least like 8 or 16. Every once in a while, like if I'm teaching a single twist, I'll have a tutorial on 8 or 12 divisions. But mostly it's 16, 24, 32, 48. So that's how you can separate out these different ways of using some number fold. And then mirror symmetry describes the line of reflection, where there's the same thing on opposite sides. My voice is really not cooperating today. Oh well. And another math definition, an object is chiral when it has a rotational sense and it cannot be reoriented by rotating in any dimension into the opposite rotational sense. So this is like your right hand and your left hand. You cannot rotate your right hand and make it into a left hand. And so all of the twists come in left and right-handed versions. And if you want to change the twist from one rotational sense to the other, you need to reverse all of the mountain and valley assignments. And by the way, you do not change the rotational sense of a twist by flipping the paper over. This is something that's often confusing for people, because if you have like a clock, It's rotating clockwise if you look at it from one side, but if you look at it from the other side, it's rotating counterclockwise. With a twist, when you flip the paper over, you are mirroring all the folds and also changing all the mountain valley assignments. And so you don't actually change the rotational sense because you've performed two moves that would change it. So it changes back when you flip the paper over. And then this is the math part that isn't usually taught in high school. Planar symmetry groups. And these are arrangements of symmetry points or mirror symmetry lines that make infinitely repeating patterns. So the basic ones that I typically work with are things that repeat like a triangle, where there's triangles pointing up, triangles pointing down, and corners of triangles. Those are the three distinct positions of threefold rotational symmetry. Things that repeat like a square, where there's the center of the square, the corner of the square, and the center of the edge of the square. So the center of the square and the corner of the square both have four of the same thing on the four sides. And the center of the edge has the same thing on opposite sides, but not all four. And then things that repeat like a hexagon, where the symmetry points are the center of the hexagon. You see 6 of the same everywhere around you. The corner of the hexagon, you see 3 of the same everywhere around you. And the center of the edge of the hexagon, where you see 2 of the same on opposite sides. So there's other planar symmetry groups. There's finer divisions of triangular, square, and hexagon. There's actually specifically 17 different ways to arrange symmetry points and lines that make repeating patterns. But the key ones for origami tessellations are these 3, plus parallelograms, rectangles, and columns, and I have full videos on each of those. And also videos on how to draw crease patterns that use these different types of symmetry so that you can draw a portion of it and then continue folding more. And hi Erlu in the chat, I'm glad you're enjoying it. And then tilings. In math, oftentimes tessellations and tilings are spoken about interchangeably. Tilings in the mathematical sense are any arrangement of shapes with no gaps that cover a flat surface. And really, if you're getting into the math heavy side of it, they'll specify like, oh, is this a 2D surface? Is this a flat surface? Is it hyperbolic? Is it whatever? Is it 3D? But we're talking about flat 2D surfaces. For origami, each tiling is composed of twist tiles. So each tile in the tiling, like this one down below, represents a twist in a pattern. And so the length of the edge matters, how it's connected matters, and what shape it is matters. So we want shapes that are convex, and that's a math term that means there's no dents. Because if you try to fold a twist with a dent in the side, like let's say I had this shape where I take a bite out of the square. If you try to actually, oh, and one thing I should mention is that the shape of the tile is the same as the shape of the center of the twist. So if you try to take a shape with a dent in it, and fold a twist, you're in trouble because at that point, at the corner of the dent, you have to tear the paper to get it to fold. So we don't like cutting the paper for our tessellations. This has been explored, a series of abominations, which is very fun to think about, but it's not what I teach. And then we use these shapes in edge-to-edge arrangements. So the whole edge of one twist matches the whole edge of the next. And there's some caveats here. You can get away with some funny business. But the reason for that constraint is that the pleat from one twist goes through the edge and connects to the pleat from the next twist. So if you had two different shapes connecting to the same edge, you would need to find an interesting way to connect those pleats. And then most of the tilings that I work with are two colorable. So all of the red shapes share edges with white shapes. All of the white shapes share edges with red shapes. And this is a really useful property because then the right-handed twists all connect pleats to left-handed twists, and that can lay down flat. And then continuing onwards, then there's symmetry applications on the tiling, which I also call extended symmetry patterns in the tiling. So this is a choice of which tiles will be the same in the pattern. The tiling doesn't tell you which tiles are the same. So in this structure where we've got hexagons and triangles, we could say, oh, all the hexagons are the same. Or we could say, this hexagon is the same as that hexagon over there and this one over here. And by the time we specify two that are the same, our symmetry choices expand that everywhere. But I do want to point out, I've got the same choices of dark blue hexagons in this pattern on the left as I do in this pattern on the right. It's a choice of whether that center position is a position of threefold symmetry, like it is on the right, or sixfold symmetry, like it is on the left, that distinguishes these two colorings. And those repeats that are the same can be pretty far apart. In fact, arbitrarily far apart. So that's one of the reasons why I know that there's infinitely many possible origami tessellations. So this coloring of the tiling is a way of showing where the symmetry points are going to be in the pattern. And, excuse me. And then we can use that information to say, oh, there are two distinct hexagons in this coloring and only one triangle. Or we can say there are three distinct hexagons and two distinct triangles. Or in this case, there are three distinct hexagons and three distinct triangles. And so then when we're designing our pattern, we can use those distinctions to work out what choices we need to make. And yeah, earlier the hexagons with the squares, with the triangles in between, like I had a few slides ago, that's an interesting one. Mixing different grid types for the same pattern is a special challenge. I've seen Alessandro Beber do it, and more power to him. So then each tile I mentioned each shape in the tessellation is known as, or in the tiling rather, is known as a tile, and it represents a twist. And we see this best through the connectivity of the pattern. So if we put a dot in the center of each tile and connect dots where the tiles share an edge, that is equivalent to putting the dot in the middle of each twist and connecting twists that share a pleat. And we'll see, we can draw this structure on a crease pattern. Also, I call it the skeleton of the crease pattern, which again is coming up in a little bit. And the shape of the tile, like I mentioned earlier, is controlling the number and directions, and also the pleat depths of the pleats coming out of that corresponding twist. So, and for the pleat depths, the depth of the pleat is proportional to the length of the tile edge. So when you have a trapezoid, we have 3 short edges and 1 long edge. That long edge is twice as long as the short edges. We can kind of visualize a trapezoid on this grid of triangles. And the pleat depth coming out the long side of the trapezoid twist is 2 spacings, where the pleat depth coming out of the other 3 directions is 1 spacing. So the tile edge length is twice as long, the pleat depth is twice as deep. And so sometimes the tiling can be directly overlaid on the tessellation. We need to rotate it so that this corner goes up top, this corner goes at the bottom. We can directly overlay and we get the exact same pattern. But that is the uncommon case, and there's a lot more variety in patterns that do not follow that rule. Typically, to get the tiling to overlay directly on the crease pattern, you have to use regular twists, so regular shapes, square, equilateral triangle, hexagon, and you have to have all the twists on the same side of the paper, and you have to use a consistent spacing throughout the pattern. None of which is a given. And then there's crease patterns. We've seen some crease patterns earlier for the pleats and pleat intersections and twists. This is a map of all the folds that will be needed to complete a pattern, including their mountain valley assignments. And for twist-based flat foldable origami, which is what I teach, these crease patterns are composed of twists connected by pleats. So it's important to be able to recognize, oh, that is an open hexagon twist on the front. This is a closed triangle twist on the front. This is an open hexagon twist on the back. And then you can go through and say, are those the only 3 twists in this pattern? Yes. Okay, great. Then you look at the relationships between the twists. From this hexagon on the front to the triangles, it's the same spacing every time. From the open hexagon on the back to the triangles, you're alternating 2 spaces along the mountain fold, or 2, 4, 5 spaces along the mountain fold. So close, far, close, far, close, far. And for the triangles, 1 pleat is going to an open hexagon on the front, 1 pleat is going a close spacing to an open hexagon on the back, and 1 pleat is going a far spacing to an open hexagon on the back. If you haven't recognized this pattern, this is Chiva Rumbera, and I do have a tutorial in the Advent of Tess 2024 series. And then there's the skeleton of the crease pattern, which I mentioned earlier, you can draw the skeleton on the tiling as well. And this is showing the connectivity of like, oh yes, we go hexagon, triangle, rhombus, triangle. That's actually why this tiling is called hex tri rhomb tri. And some other terms that I use to talk about crease patterns and skeletons, and also while I'm folding. Two twists are neighboring if they share a pleat. This is really easy to see in the skeleton. The neighbors are dots that are connected. And then there's a loop of twists. A loop of twists is the set of twists around a blank space in the skeleton. So I've got this loop that's hexagon, triangle, rhombus, triangle. And a lot of the other loops are also equivalent. Hexagon, triangle, rhombus, triangle, like this one. But then there's these other loops, which is rhombus, triangle, rhombus, triangle, rhombus, triangle. No hexagons involved. By the way, this crease pattern is for dancing ribbons. I have a tutorial for that one, I believe in Advent of Test 2022. And you can talk about your pattern by saying, okay, there's a hexagon position, a triangle position, a rhombus position. And then going into, okay, there's a hexagon, triangle, rhombus, triangle loop. And there's an alternating loop of 6 twists with rhombi and triangles. And these are ways of describing the pattern, ways of memorizing the pattern even, that help you to save all of the information in a more reasonable way. And now talking about folding style. So a corrugation is a 3D pattern where you can see all of the parts of the paper. This particular one is a herringbone corrugation, also known as the Muraori corrugation. These patterns can compress and expand, also known as they can actuate all the folds at the same time. They are more useful for engineers than the things that I usually teach. Most corrugations are, technically speaking, mathematically speaking, tessellations, but if you're speaking in the origami community, these are separate categories. So you've got your corrugations and you've got your tessellations, and you can get finer grained with your, I guess, splitting the hairs. Mine would, strictly speaking, be twist-based, flat foldable origami tessellations. And corrugations may or may not need a grid. This one you could fold without the grid. This particular example does use a grid. And there's, a lot of variations. Often these corrugations for engineering applications are pre-scored, and then you have to go and pinch every scored line before you can collapse everything into place. And speaking of pre-creasing, how to collapse a tessellation: you fold the grid, you pre-crease all of the off-grid lines, you start collapsing, by which I mean activating all of the pre-creases at once. A miracle occurs, and then you get your finished tessellation. So pre-creasing pre-creases are folds that are unfolded immediately, but they do get used in the final folded form, and they are specific to the desired pattern. So I distinguish between gridding and pre-creasing. And then a collapse is a process of activating many pre-creases at once to get to a final folded state. This is necessary for some patterns, like corrugations, and also twist-based patterns with highly overlapping twists, or a lot of twists where Some of the pleats are flipped in their Mountain Valley assignments. And like, for example, if I was doing an open hexagon iso area twist, I would want to pre-crease that before folding the iso area form, so that I could have higher precision than just going for it and pinching the new folds into place. In contrast, how to fold a twist-based tessellation: you fold a grid, then you fold a twist, and then you look for pleat overlaps. If there's no pleat overlaps, you fold another twist until there are pleat overlaps. Then you go and open up those pleat overlaps to fold more twists, and you loop between folding twists and resolving pleat overlaps until you reach your finished tessellation. This often involves squashing twists. So when you squash a twist, you create new folds by flattening around the center. I mentioned this earlier on the number lines of twists slide. And this is the opposite of pre-creasing. You're creating new folds on the fly as you're making the pattern, and they stay folded and stay permanently part of the final form. Resolving pleat overlaps is kind of a vague catch-all for opening up a pleat overlap or several to add in new twists or wraps. And generally the way this works is I have a set of parallel pleats on the pattern that I'm working on, and I work from one side to the other. So I add a twist, this sends a pleat through the rest of the set of parallel pleats, and I work my way down, resolving one pleat overlap. It shifts the overlaps down, add another twist, resolving an overlap, it shifts the overlaps down, and you go all the way down until you have no more overlaps. So yeah, and comment in the chat, there are many people who also refer to corrugations as tessellations. It is, when you're talking about the folding, it is kind of a different discipline. It's a very different set of techniques. And then tiling breaks. So tiling breaks are straight lines or convex without dents loops in a tiling composed entirely of tile boundaries. So as this animation runs, you'll see every stopping point, every outer boundary is what I would call a tiling break, and it is entirely on tile boundaries. These are very convenient stopping points while folding because all of the pleats that cross a straight line in the tiling are parallel. So these straight lines or convex loops, when you stop at those boundaries, you have no pleat overlaps. And this is a term I made up, so it has limited utility in talking to other people, like mathematicians. They won't know what this is, but it's very convenient for thinking about how to fold your origami tessellations. Likewise, pseudo-tiling breaks. These breaks cut through tiles, so you'll see the gray on the edges. That is where I'll partially set up twists, like these half hexagons, and then they'll turn into whole twists later on. So you'll often see a rhombus set up as a triangle wrap. If you want to stop at these boundaries and make a border for the whole pattern, I'd recommend going ahead and folding those twists as the shape inside of the boundary. And again, this is a term that I made up. And then a ring around the center. I use that to refer to the layer of twists that I'm adding around whatever has already been folded. And these can have different thicknesses. So coming out from this giant hexagon, I would say we're going to work on a single thickness ring around the center, ending at a true tiling break. This boundary does not cut through any twists, followed by a double thickness. So there's two tile edge widths to get to the next break that does cut through twists. So it ends at a pseudo break. And then we'll have another double thickness ring around the center, ending at a true tiling break. So this is what I'm thinking about in my mind as I'm folding the patterns. And then some other little terms, a partial twist happens when you're folding at the edge of the paper and you cannot fit a full twist in the space available. It often leads to these kind of spiky borders. Here, I took what would have been a partial rhombus and I turned it into a triangle. But I could have equivalently decided to make it look more like a rhombus, but I wouldn't have gotten the whole thing. These are annoying to fold. The paper is more prone to tearing, and that's why I avoid them pretty much entirely in my Advent of Test tutorials. And you can also align the repeats of the pattern. Notice how this star is showing up in a line same distance to the edge for all three of these repeats. That is because I used a rotated grid. So instead of a standard triangle grid on a hexagon or a diagonal triangle grid on a hexagon, I chose a specific fraction from the crease pattern of this design, which is named Star Power. I think it's in one of the Advent of Tess ebooks. If it is, it's 2022. And I used that fraction of the edge, so instead of 0 or 1/2 for the standard and the diagonal grids, respectively, I would pick a different fraction of the edge to start the line through the center. And then, for this case, the repeats are not aligned with the tiling breaks, so I folded all the way to the edge of the paper to get these repeats showing up aligned with the edge. If your repeats are aligned with the tiling breaks, then you can have a nice pleated border. And then there's advanced pleat management, which is a catch-all term for any kind of wrap or move that goes beyond combinations of triangle and compound wraps. And I would include like a compound wrap of a single depth pleat and a double depth pleat as advanced compound wrap. But advanced pleat management often shows up when you have twists really close together, like in this pattern. And then design terms. An alternate ending, this is another of my terms, is a pattern that shares the same center as a simpler pattern. And these are often designed from the inside out. So you specify the center first, and then you decide, like, okay, I'm going to fill these outer symmetry patterns with a bunch of triangles, or I'm going to use triangles and rhombi to go between the repeats of the center. And this, I mean, technically could be done on the fly while you're folding, but in practice, I almost always draw my crease patterns on the computer first, and only then fold them on paper, partly because I'm using rotated grids that are specific to each pattern. So you'll notice that the left pattern here, that's not quite a diagonal grid. The middle one is a diagonal grid, goes straight across. And the one on the right is not quite a diagonal grid either. Those grid lines are not perpendicular to the edge. So that's why I like to draw them on the computer first. And then you can also design from the outside in, meaning that I choose what structure is going to be in the position of threefold symmetry, how that's going to manage the position of twofold symmetry, and work in towards the middle. And this is actually one that I've never folded. Fun fact. And this is a valuable thing to do because you can often get in trouble with just the geometry of the symmetry points as it relates to the geometry of the sizes of twists. Because with triangle twists, with rhombus twists, with frankly hybrid hexagon twists and different sizes of hexagon twists, it's kind of unpredictable if I have two pleats coming into an area and then the math dictates where the symmetry point has to be relative to those two pleats. It's kind of up in the air whether I can resolve that into a twist. But if I'm coming into a hexagon in the center in a position of sixfold rotational symmetry, whatever distance those pleats are from the center is fine. They are all foldable. And then this word motif, and that is an art word, that is basically saying, okay, it has this element in the pattern. And that's all it means. It's this visually identifiable element in the pattern. And then flagstone patterns. This is a common distinction in origami tessellations. I would say that this pattern is not a fully flagstone pattern because these shapes that are lining up next to each other don't cover the entire surface. There are gaps. And flagstone patterns specifically have other twists on the back. They have to have other twists on the back because what you're looking for with a flagstone pattern is a grout line between the shapes. So this is mimicking tiles on a floor, backsplash in the kitchen, these kinds of patterns in origami tessellations. So I would say this one has flagstone elements, but it's not a completely flagstone pattern. And I'll often use flagstone motifs in my designs. This just means there's some clump of pattern, some clump of twists that is flagstone, and then there's other things going on. There's gaps, there's other parts of the pattern too. And then I'll also talk about clusters of triangles, either clusters of 4 or clusters of 6. In this particular pattern, there are both clusters of 4 and clusters of 6. There's a cluster of 4 that's pretty easily identifiable, this little pyramid of darker space. You actually have the same cluster of 4 on the backside. And then I think of this space between the clusters of 4 as a cluster of 6 triangles, where you have open triangles on the front alternating with open triangles on the back. And so then I can simplify this pattern that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different triangle positions into a cluster of 6 and 2 clusters of 4, which are actually the same but on opposite sides of the paper. So that takes the complexity from like 6 things and all of their relationships down to 3 things with fewer relationships and kind of really 2.5 things, because there's the cluster of 6, the cluster of 4, and the identical cluster of 4 on the back. So it's a way of simplifying a complicated pattern down into an easier representation to remember. Likewise, a meta triangle in the tiling is a group of tiles whose border is a triangle. A meta hexagon is a group of tiles whose border is a hexagon. These are ways of grouping tiles which correspond to twists together so that I can chunk the parts and have fewer things in my working memory. And then there's the difficulty rubric for the difficulty rating of each of the different patterns. I have a two-dimensional difficulty rating where, and like you'll see 1 star to 5 stars, that's a very one-dimensional scale. But within that, there's a two-dimensional rubric where the diagonals of the 2 dimensions get the same difficulty level. And so the 1As, the simple twist difficulty and simple structural complexity, have basic twists, so closed or open hexagon, triangle, or square, in an alternating pattern that has good tiling breaks. And then, and there's ways of putting hexagons and triangles together that do not alternate and do not have great tiling, or still have good tiling breaks, but you have to go further to get to them. And those more complex structures would be a 2A instead. Then there's different sizes of hexagons and triangles. You could have a double open hexagon that pushes it into a moderate twist difficulty. You could have a hybrid hexagon that pushes it into advanced twist difficulty. You could have more complex structures and even more complex structures. My line to be an advanced structure is 6 or more distinct positions in the pattern. And then, so anything with 3 to 5 distinct twists, you could have folding in columns, you could have pseudo tiling breaks, extended symmetries of simple tilings. Those are all moderately structurally complex. The advanced stuff, we have 6 or more distinct twists, repeats that are really far apart, also super high twist density, often to the point where pre-creasing is required. And then on the twist difficulty, rhombus, trapezoid, and right triangle twists all land in the moderate category. General sizes of all of the twists and hybrid square twists. I feel like this rubric is kind of a snapshot of how I felt about certain twists at different points in time. Where I was more comfortable with hybrid square twists, but less comfortable with hybrid hexagon or rhombus twists. So those ended up in the advanced category. Also mixed depth, compound, iso area. And then this clustered is kind of a cluster of 4 situation, but more structural, where you can't really separate out the individual twists and the whole group has to be folded at the same time. So those are all the definitions that I have for you guys right now. Is there anything else that you'd like me to define? And I can go ahead and bring back my face. Yes, there we go. So yeah, I'm not seeing any more questions. So we'll take that as this is a very thorough set of definitions. We went for over an hour, and I'll leave it at that. So happy folding, everyone. Next week I have a tutorial for you. It'll be a pattern with hybrid square twists, and it's on a 32 fold square grid, so go ahead and get that grid ready, and I will see you next week. Happy folding.